questions, tomorrow's answers, a journey toward understanding medical cannabis in children. My name is Dr. Lauren Kelly, and I serve as the Scientific Director and Principal Investigator for the Canadian Childhood Cannabinoid Clinical Trial Research Team. Our panelists are joining us today from coast to coast. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation people who call this land home. I myself am based here in Winnipeg on Treaty 1 territory and in the heartland of the Métis Nation. We are delighted to offer these webinars live, and we'll be sharing recorded versions on our website, which is www.c4trials.com. Questions today can be submitted in several ways at any time throughout the presentation. You can submit questions online using the Slido link in the YouTube description or by searching the hashtag C4T Webinars 2021. You can also use this hashtag on Twitter, or you can post questions directly into the YouTube comments section. All of the questions that were asked during registration have already been queued for our panelists. Before we begin today, a few disclosures. I am the Scientific Director for the Canadian Childhood Cannabinoid Clinical Trial Platform, or C4T, and we hold public funding from several organizations, including the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Canadian Cancer Society, MyTax, and the Sick Kids Foundation. I'm a member of the Health Products Containing Cannabis Scientific Advisory Board at Health Canada and a Board of Directors member for the Canadian Consortium for the Investigation of Cannabinoids. I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare related to this webinar today. A little bit about C4T, just to understand why we are all here together today. C4T was founded in 2018. We are a group of academic researchers, healthcare providers, parents, and youth, some of who you will hear from today, who conduct a variety of different research studies, ranging from studies on ethics of cannabis use, schools, as you'll hear about today, all the way to clinical trials. We have 101 active members with more than 20 ongoing research projects. We offer monthly meetings for members, and you can learn all about this on our website. We also offer a newsletter twice a year that has updates from our team. The agenda for today: first, we're going to hear from 3 of our wonderful youth partners about building trust and advancing cannabis research with youth partners. Second, we're going to hear from Dr. Holly Mansell on medical cannabis in schools. And finally, we'll talk about the complexities of regulated cannabis research in pediatrics and how we can streamline this process for the future. We'll also have Dr. Jennifer Anderson joining us for a discussion panel. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers and panelists for today. First, we have Trinity Lowthian. Trinity is a 19-year-old student pursuing her Bachelor's of Nutrition and Food Science at the University of Ottawa. She has lived with headaches for the past 6 years as a result of chronic illness. She's a youth partner with C4T and is excited to partner in research to open up more possibilities for other patients and lead to a fulfilling life in spite of pain. Our next youth partner is Zahra Alidina. Zahra is this 19-year-old student studying kinesiology at McMaster University. She has lived with headaches and migraines for the past 5 years. She's a youth partner with C4T and is excited to contribute to designing research studies that will benefit all patients. Our third youth partner today is Melila Chesick-Gordis. Melila is a youth partner for C4T, originally from Vancouver, and now living in Kingston, Ontario as a Queen's University student in the second year of her kinesiology program. Melila has experienced migraines and headaches for the past 4 years. When headaches started interfering with her hobbies, like dancing and other activities, she tried several treatment options. Unfortunately, she hasn't found a treatment that has allowed her to live a headache-free life. As a youth partner, she looks forward to contributing to our chronic daily headache study because it will ultimately help youth like her who deserve a life without chronic headache and migraine. Welcome, all 3 of you. I really am looking forward to hearing how we can work together today. Our second talk will be from Dr. Holly Mansell. Dr. Mansell is an associate professor in the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition at the University of Saskatchewan and a clinical pharmacist who specializes in transplantation. She has a broad range of research interests, which include solid organ transplantation, cannabis in youth, patient education, and patient-oriented research. She is the primary investigator on a variety of research studies, ranging from randomized controlled trials to interventional drug studies and qualitative research. Dr. Mansell is the Knowledge Translation Pillar Lead for the Cannabinoid Research Initiative of Saskatchewan and the Chair for the C4T Medical Cannabis in Schools Working Group. She is currently working on a PhD in health sciences with a focus on cannabis in children. Welcome, Holly. Our final speaker before we head to the panel will be Breanne Stewart. Breanne Stewart is a nurse and is an Associate Director for Clinical Trials at the Maternal Infant Child Youth Research Network, or MyCERN. She's based out of Edmonton, Alberta, and plays a critical role in ensuring MyCERN is able to build family and child-centric research and education capabilities. She provides support to the Clinical Trial Consortium, a group of 18 clinical research units representing the academic child health centers across Canada, to streamline and improve clinical trial processes and systems to enhance efficiency of regulated and non-regulated clinical trials. Breanne is also the trial manager for C4T's regulated multi-center cannabis clinical trials. Welcome, Breanne. And then joining us for the panel discussion will be Dr. Jennifer Anderson. Dr. Anderson is a mom to 3 and a family physician who works to advocate and educate about the role of cannabis in pediatric epilepsy. In addition to this, she has worked as a consultant for other physicians to co-manage patients of all ages to navigate cannabis medically. In the past 5 years, she has advocated to government, educational systems, and the medical system for change and removal of barriers to patient access. She's advised for major cannabis companies in Canada and advocated for reduced costs for children with much success. She has worked to help families navigate the system for their children in her province of Manitoba and in other provinces as well as in the UK, the US, and in Australia. In all of this, she has taken both personal and professional risks to help families around the world. Despite all of this, being a mom is her highest calling, and she works hard to put her kids as the biggest priority. You can learn more about the amazing work that Dr. Anderson is doing by visiting her website, which is drjenniferandersonCannabisMD.com. So thank you everyone for joining us today. First up, I'm going to welcome Trinity, Melila, and Zahra to the stage. And I will pass the mic over to you.
Hi, are we able to get our slides? There we go. So thank you so much for that introduction, Lauren. We can go ahead to the next slide. So today our presentation is going to be kind of discussing our role as youth partners with C4T and some of the bigger things that we've discussed as we've worked with them. So first, we're going to be talking a little bit about our involvement as youth partners with C4T and some of the things that we've done throughout this process and kind of the work that we do with them. And then we'll be getting to 5 big questions that have come up throughout our work. So the first one is the difference between research with the pediatric population versus the adult population. And as people that have been in the pediatric medical system, what we think researchers should recognize when working with kids and youth in the medical system compared to just working with the adult population. Next, we'll be talking a little bit about, actually, go back to the slide before, thank you. Next, we'll be talking about recruitment for studies and clinical trials. And one of the big things that came up was whether or not recruiting youth through social media was a good idea. And that was a big conversation that we had, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. The next question is where patients should look for reputable health information and where we tend to look for that information, and whether or not we feel as youth and as young people there is enough access to reputable information. And next, we'll be looking a little bit at how young people tend to make decisions about their own health and what treatments they want to get involved in and where to go for their information and how they really make decisions about their own life and their own health. And then as a bit of a conclusion, we'll talk a bit about what we really want researchers to know and understand when talking about the future of research when working with the pediatric population. Next slide, please. So Zahra, Trinity, and myself, we are all youth partners with C4T, and specifically we've been working on the dose finding study in adolescents with chronic daily headaches. So as you heard before, we've all experienced headaches and migraines in the past, and as a result of that, have been involved in the medical system. So we have experience that we can provide a little bit of information when planning studies and clinical trials. We can use our own experience to say, I think this is something that's important to think about because this is something that I experienced in the past. So giving information to the researchers and people designing these studies that they may not realize since we're kind of on the patient side of it. So what that really looks like is we'll be given different documents like consent forms or daily logs that patients might need to fill out, and we'll go through them and we'll give our feedback on them. So saying, like, for example, let's say there's a 10-year-old child filling out a daily log and we're going through it and you notice, oh, that's a word that I think when I was 10 years old, I probably wouldn't understand. So we'll go back and write down that feedback and say, hey, I think these are a few words that maybe you could change to make it a little bit more accessible to the younger population that you're working with. So similar thing with the consent forms, daily logs, protocols, and just other feedback that we can give for the whole clinical trial process. Next slide, please.
So one of the common discussions that we had as youth partners working with C4T was establishing the difference between doing research in the pediatric and in the adult population. And one of the key differences for this is the involvement of caregivers. So especially when working with youth and children, the caregivers are an important part of their care team since they tend to live with them and know the child and youth better than the doctors would. And so when establishing times for clinic appointments, blood work, it's important to not only consider the patient's schedule, but also the schedule of the caregiver. So a tip that we found would be very useful for this is to establish a common date and time for each month. Say if it includes clinic appointments monthly, to have them be on the second Tuesday of every month at, say, 3 o'clock for that specific patient. So that way it's easy for the caregiver to take time off work. Also, with children under the age of 12, with exceptions for development, there tends to be more caregiver involvement, whereas for youth over the age of 12, they have a lot more autonomy and are able to make decisions regarding their own care on their own, and you'll be talking more with the patient than with the caregiver. Also, compensation for studies varies in the pediatric population. So for this, kids tend not to be as motivated by, say, free parking passes for the hospital, but kids would be more motivated by compensation in the form of gift cards. So for example, an Amazon gift card or a gift card to the movies would be useful compensation for studies, as well as the timing of medication administration, which is a very fun rhyme. It does vary for children because when you're dealing with youth, if you're taking a medication every morning, it might work to take it at 8 a.m. before school on the weekdays. But then you get to the weekend, and that's when these teenagers like to sleep in. And so taking it at 8 a.m. won't always be feasible, and they're not going to interrupt their sleep schedule just to take a medication. But then if you flip it around and want to give them the medication around, say, 4 p.m. after school, this could work on the weekends when they'd be home at 4 p.m., but it might not always work in the day during the weekdays when they have extracurriculars or have a job. So keeping in mind the unique needs of each individual. Also, the measures of quality of life, especially in the pediatric population, this is a benefit because they can be quite objective. So you can use how many days they were at school in the week versus how many days they missed school in the week, or their participation in extracurricular events compared to their baseline or what they signed up for is a useful measure of quality of life. And then finally, with the pediatric population, once you turn 18, at most centers, you're no longer going to the children's hospital or seeing your pediatrician, but you have still been enrolled in the study and you still want to find out the study results. So it's still important for the researchers to follow up with the study results by contacting the individuals in the study because they want to know really how much they helped and what came out of the study. Next slide.
Okay, so moving on, a big theme or question that came up during our discussions with the C4T members was, how do youth want to be recruited for research studies? And it was to great surprise to a lot of the C4T members that almost all of the youth said that they did not want to be contacted through social media. Youth felt that the targeted ads could be perceived as non-reputable, the information can seem misleading, and it just might not be accurate or enough information. And, given how much time youth do spend on social media platforms, you would think that this is the method we prefer, but there's definitely a sense of boundary between using social media for leisure versus using it for academic information and, things like research studies. So this kind of brings the question that what methods would youth prefer besides social media? So being contacted by their doctor or their healthcare provider directly, this way you know that it's a reliable research study because it is coming from someone that you trust. You can ask all the questions that you want and you can get a full understanding of the study before agreeing to participate. Another great way is posters in the doctor's offices, whether that is in the waiting room or inside clinical rooms. It's a great, easy, inexpensive way to recruit youth, especially while youth are waiting for their healthcare providers for their appointment. Another big one would be trusted websites. So this could be anything from hospital websites or university or college websites. This is something that youth have definitely learned are reputable sources. And lastly, a big one that all of the youth preferred was to be contacted directly through email. This way we could get all the information that we needed and it feels more personalized and like they're specifically asking us to join instead of this mass targeted ad that we might see on Instagram or other social media platforms. So while youth do spend a lot of time on social media, there is definitely this boundary that most of us have on how we would like to be contacted for educational things. Next slide, please.
So kind of continuing on this topic about getting involved in studies and also looking for information, because as Zahra kind of discussed, the internet is very big and it's hard to decipher what is reliable information and what is not. So as looking at more like the teen and youth side of things, I think we learn to develop, especially through school, skills to be able to say, hey, I think this is reliable information, or no, I'm not going to look there. So in terms of looking for information regarding possible treatments, I think teens and youth will first of all go to their parents because that is a big source of information in our lives. Next, going to doctors, and also having the skills to go to those trusted websites that we recognize either from universities or clinics or hospitals. So because we have those skills, we can do our own research online and then also go to trusted people in our lives. But when you're looking at younger kids, so maybe under the age of 12, where you can get your information from, it really narrows. So you're not going to see an 8-year-old kid sitting down on their computer and Googling, should I be taking cannabis to treat my headaches? They're really limited to information from their parents and their doctors. And first of all, parents, especially when we're young, we may feel like they know everything, but the truth is they don't always. And while doctors are a really great source of information, they're not as easy to access. You don't have appointments any day that you want. So that can kind of limit that access as well. So something that came up while working with C4T is this idea of increasing access to kid-friendly sources. So providing information that is easily digestible for kids and accessible as well. So this could be online and again, coming from a trusted platform and resource, and providing information about different treatments and how they work and the possible pros and cons that are associated with them. So this could be either as like a website to read through, maybe for older kids, but I would say more likely that kids would actually be interested in would be some kind of animated video where these concepts are explained and walked through and put in a light where it's not such a scary and daunting topic. So this could also give kids a sense of autonomy about their health, because a lot of the time it's like, okay, put it in the hands of my parents and my doctors and they're making all the choices for me. and I don't really understand what's going on. So as younger kids, if they can have an opportunity to sit down and watch maybe a 5-10 minute video about this is what might be happening when you have a migraine, or this is how this certain treatment could work. And these are some great things that might come with it, and these are some things that might be a little bit uncomfortable that will come with it. Can really give kids a sense of, okay, I understand what's happening, and maybe less reluctant to try it, and decrease a lot of anxiety that might be associated with any big things in the medical system that they may be trying, because it can be really overwhelming. And giving kids this access to information that they can really understand might be a way to decrease a lot of that anxiety. Next slide.
So now that we know where children and youth might find or might want to find some examples of treatment for their health, they still have the information, but now they need to make the decision about whether or not to go ahead with the treatment. So how do we as youth, and how would children make decisions about their own health? So the first thing, which is a very accessible resource to most people, is to talk to trusted friends and family. Our friends and family know us way better than any doctors could ever know us, and it's easy and more comfortable to bounce ideas off of them. And even as adults, I'm sure that whenever you make a decision, you talk to your friends, you talk to your partner, and you might talk to your family. And it just helps to solidify your decision and to view all perspectives of the issue. Also, you can obviously discuss options with your doctor. It's good if you feel comfortable with your doctor to be able to ask them any questions you might have, or just to have somebody on your care team who you trust, who you can confide in, and they know the options of treatments best, and they might have other experience with similar patients and know the outcomes of those. Also, we do our own independent research. So using the sources that Melila said, so hospital websites are a great source of reputable information. And sometimes on these sites, it will list the pros and cons of potential treatments, or we can do that on our own and discover what might be the best thing with this treatment, what might be some of the risks, and then weigh those to figure out what might be best for us. So next slide.
Okay, so what are the big takeaway messages, and what do we want researchers to know? So there are definitely a lot of things to keep in mind. And a big one is, taking those considerations about dealing with the pediatric population versus adults, in that sense of compensation, timing of medications, and all of those factors. There's definitely a need to utilize alternative methods for being contacted besides social media. And this way you can ensure that you're actually going to get enough participants for your research study. And so youth, we use a variety of sources for information, such as family, friends, doctors, and websites. And there's definitely a need for more kid-friendly resources, especially for research studies that are more directed to younger pediatric populations. And involving youth in the planning stages of research studies is really important to make sure that that study is beneficial to all patients. Youth definitely have different outcomes and needs, and what we believe is important from a study might be different than what a researcher thinks is important from a study. And lastly, following up on study results. If a youth has invested their time into a research study, but then they aged out of pediatrics, they still want to know what happens, and just keeping them in the loop is really important. So thank you for your time today, and if there's any further questions, feel free to ask them during the panel discussion.
Wonderful. That was really great. And I'm very excited for the panel today. You all presented such great and really eye-opening information for researchers. And so I'm really happy to hear you advocate that other researchers involve youth early as well, because I know we have learned a ton, and I don't think we could dream of designing a trial any other way. So thank you very much. And we'll have some more discussion in panel. Next, I'd like to welcome Dr. Holly Mansell, who will be speaking about medical cannabis in schools.
Sorry, I'm just trying to navigate my slides here. Can everybody see that okay? All right, so thank you, Lauren, for the introduction. And first, I'll just start off by saying that I'm joining you from my home, which is on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, and I have no conflicts to declare for this presentation. So I became involved in cannabis research and education back around the time when cannabis was becoming legalized recreationally in Canada. And at that time, I was primarily interested in more of a harm reduction for vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women or lactating women or youth and that sort of thing. And I was part of the Cannabinoid Initiative of Saskatchewan. And a team of colleagues and I had the opportunity to collaborate with some nursing students and their faculty members. And through this collaboration, I had the opportunity to sort of create with youth this educational program about cannabis for children. And again, it was focused more on sort of the recreational risk reduction piece, but it went on to become approved as a resource by the Ministry of Education. And when we were creating that program, we were really sort of cognizant of the fact that, recreational cannabis is one thing, but medical use has a really important purpose as well. And so we wanted to make sure that that message didn't get lost. And so as a pharmacist, I also knew that with all of the changes, there were going to be many, many more questions coming our way. And so I got really interested in that. And that's kind of how I came into this medical cannabis space. So around that time, I also joined the C4T, and we had formed a medical cannabis in schools working group. And this group was really created because there seemed to be just so many stories from healthcare providers and from families about the challenges of using medical cannabis. And some of this was extending into schools. And so we got together and we sort of put some terms of reference together, and we decided that in principle, our goal was to create comprehensive family-centered advocacy, policy development, health promotion, education, dissemination for safe medical cannabis use in Canadian schools. And our ultimate goal would be to lead and facilitate practice changes related to medical cannabis use in schools. And so that's all great in theory, but the one thing about advocacy is that it's really hard to advocate for something and to try and make practice change for a problem that people don't really know exists. And so we were hearing all these anecdotal stories, but there really wasn't anything in the literature. And so that's where we decided to kind of do this the scientific way. And we planned 3 studies to look at medical cannabis in schools and really to learn more as a group. And so that's what I'm going to present today. I'm going to share the results from the first 2 studies. And this is the first time I've had the opportunity to talk about this. So I'm really excited. Okay, so the first one was a scoping review to review the literature on medical cannabis in schools, and it consisted of 2 phases. So we had a scientific literature search and then a policy review. So for this literature search, we looked at 5 medical databases, and you might have heard of them before: Medline, Embase, Scopus, CINAHL, and Web of Science. And we found over 1,200 articles were related to our search terms. And then when we kind of went through them and we removed the duplicates, we read the abstracts, we found that there were only 37 actually that really seemed to be related to what we were talking about. And then when we thoroughly reviewed them, there were really only 5. And of these 5, they all pertain to medical cannabis in schools in the United States. And they were focused towards nurses who were having kind of this conflict between federal law and state laws. And we found it really interesting because the National Association of School Nurses had really thought that their position was that only cannabis products that were regulated by the FDA should be allowed in schools. So obviously in Canada, where we don't really have a product like that, and we also have medical cannabis, which is now legal federally and provincially, that isn't really relevant to our Canadian context. So Nation also went on to provide some recommendations, which were really great for school nurses, such as, they should know about the research, the sort of everything there is to know about the cannabis, and they should be really there to sort of advocate for children. But the problem is not all schools in Canada really have school nurses as well. And so that places the burden of responsibility of some of these sort of medical cannabis related responsibilities like administration and monitoring and storage really on the educators and the school administrators. And given that, many healthcare providers in Canada aren't really that comfortable talking about medical cannabis, or their knowledge is maybe not what they want it to be, it's pretty hard to expect schools to do that without additional training and education. So the next part of our search involved a review of policies, including the cannabis legislation in Canada that pertained to this topic. And I have to say, this was something completely new for me. I'm pretty okay with reading medical literature and understanding even bench science, but when it comes to law, oh my goodness, that's a whole nother ballgame. And so I was really happy to have the help of one of our collaborators who has a legal background, Carrie O'Shea, to sort of help interpret some of these laws. So what we found was that generally speaking, the Cannabis Act and cannabis regulations are the federal regulations or legislation that we know that has decriminalized cannabis possession and cultivation and consumption and all those things. And it's really part 14 of the act that deals with the medical cannabis. And it's silent really on young people. It talks about young people using cannabis, but it doesn't really say how they can consume or use it or such details about distribution and those sorts of things. However, the federal and the territorial laws are in the legislation as well, and they help regulate it within the different jurisdictions. And so when we looked kind of through the differences between these different jurisdictions, we found a lot of sort of confusion. So one of the things is some of the law or the provinces or territories really describe in their laws just recreational cannabis. Some of it talks about both, and some of it it's really hard to determine what they're talking about at all. Also, the definition of medical cannabis really varies depending on the legislation that you're looking, making interpretation difficult. And then finally, really all of the different jurisdictions do state in some capacity that there is no smoking or vaping of cannabis allowed on school property. And some of it is right in the act itself, and whereas others, they kind of amended some smoking acts. And they don't really have any exceptions for medical cannabis. And then some provinces are even more restrictive, and they just say pretty much no cannabis consumption on school property. So the final part of the search was a review of the Ministry of Education websites to look for policies from schools and school boards on this topic. And in the whole entire country, we only found 2 directives from Alberta that really talked about and acknowledged that medical cannabis is permissible. And then we found 1 document that was quite comprehensive from Ontario, and it was educational in nature, and it was intended to provide clarity to schools and school boards around the provincial legislation with respect to medical cannabis and recreational cannabis. However, none of these documents contained the level of detail that we as a working group really wanted to see. So things like, practical, administration, storage, disposal, all of those types of things that really are important. So I think from this review, we can conclude that in Canada, there is a lack of guidance for medical cannabis administration, storage, and disposal in schools, and some policies do prohibit this type of treatment. And this unjustly shifts the burden to families and to individuals to create school plans, basically school by school. And of course, we would prefer a federally harmonized approach to supporting children who take medical cannabis in schools. So the second study was a qualitative study to learn more about the experiences of clinicians who authorize cannabis to school-aged children, and exploring the perceptions of clinicians is not really a new thing, but previous work has done this in the context of what do you know about cannabis and how comfortable are you with prescribing cannabis? We did find 1 qualitative study in Canada that talked about the experiences of pediatric neurologists, but in that study, there were only 58% of the cohort that had actually authorized medical cannabis, and the focus was not on schools at all. And so we set out to explore the perspectives of clinicians who were quite experienced in this area, meaning that they had authorized medical cannabis to children or youth in schools. And so for recruitment, we advertised through different associations where we thought they would see the materials, and networks were asked to share these recruitment materials further. And then I collected data by doing WebEx or phone interviews, and I used a semi-structured interview guide. And then for data analysis, we used something called qualitative content analysis. And so what we do with that is we go kind of line by line through the transcripts, and we ascribe unit meanings to different phrases and parts of the transcripts. And then we organize them according to themes and categories and subcategories. And so this was done collaboratively by myself and Zina Zaslowski, and we used the Deduce program for qualitative analysis. So we interviewed 13 physicians, and the interviews ranged between 15 to 51 minutes. And the most common reasons for authorizing cannabis are shown here. So treatment-resistant seizure disorders, autism, and then other treatment-resistant behavioral or mental health disorders. And then the clinicians really varied with the schools depending on their authorization approach. So some had several patients who required medical cannabis in schools, whereas others authorized it twice a day. And so they kind of avoided that daily dose in the afternoon that would be at school. And so I guess just to give you a little bit more background on that, there were 3 of our participants who had no doses at school. There were 5 of our participants who had some limited experiences, meaning they had a few patients. And then there were 5 who had a lot of experience with this topic. So this is a table that shows the characteristics of the people we interviewed. And you can see that we have representation from primarily Ontario and BC, but we do have representation from other provinces as well. And if you take a look at this last row right here, I don't even know if you can see my pointer, but I'm pointing at it. You can see the estimated number of children taking medical cannabis. And this really highlights that we did have a group that were highly experienced in this topic, because you can see here that the majority had over 20 patients. So the interviews really provided us with some rich descriptions on perceptions of medical cannabis in schools and also in general. And so we've got the results right here. You can see there's these yellow bubbles here, and they represent categories. And then these blue boxes represent sort of these subcategories below them. And that's what I'll just kind of go through quickly next. So the first category was variability. And so we found that the experiences varied across the country. And so some had very few encounters with the schools, whereas others had many. And some clinicians reported, quite positive experiences, but the experiences definitely ranged from, very prohibitive to not so great to very, very good. So there was a range. And there was a lack of consistency with respect to the school structure, policy, and logistics. And even within the same district, physicians acknowledge that each situation is different. So I've got these 2 quotes here that kind of illustrate this. The one on the right, one school refused to give cannabis oil to an 8-year-old, and they had the 12-year-old sister come down to the office to administer the afternoon dose. So it ranges from support to complete lack of support. And then on the other side here, we rely on what the patients tell us each time, and it's always something different. So the next category was challenges. And not surprisingly, there were several challenges that were identified, and we can kind of organize them according to the categories of lack of knowledge, stigma, lack of policy, and pragmatic challenges. So with lack of knowledge, this was perceived to be prevalent really across the board. So with schools, with the general public, with even the medical profession. And so participants commented on misconceptions about things like, CBD oil can make people high. There's just all kinds of misinformation on the internet. And really, there is this knowledge gap. And I like this quote right here. Really, it used to surprise me, but doesn't anymore, how little healthcare professionals know about cannabis. So the next one was stigma. And so stigma was another thing that varied as well, with some indicating that this was not an issue and others citing it as an important factor that really affected the patients and the families. And so this quote here, sometimes my patients feel like they were really discriminated against, and that can be emotionally for them. And that's really frustrating as a clinician, because here I am trying to encourage it as a medicine, and I have people who don't have medical training or expertise or knowledge protecting their own biases on it, and that can directly affect their mental health. And then there was also a lack of policy, as we kind of saw already from our previous review. And I think the point that I took from that is that it really depended on the school. There was no pattern with respect to jurisdiction at all. It was just school to school, depending on, kind of what they believed at that school. And then finally, pragmatic challenges. So there were all kinds of different challenges that were discussed around the school administration. So for instance, finding the right person to administer, who's going to do that, storing it safely within the schools, and then all of the paperwork that comes along with that. And then there were also challenges just with cannabis in general. So cost, that came up over and over. And this quote right here really kind of brings it home for me. I've got a couple of kids who tried it. It worked really well, but their parents can't afford it. So how sad is that? Also, consistent supply and product, that's a challenge, as we all know, and just different challenges with the dosage form as well, how it's not really pediatric friendly. And then finally, potential solutions. So the clinicians provided a lot of great insights on this. And the first one that came up to me was treat it like any other medication. And so this was kind of unanimous. And in some interviews, I found that, there was really this sort of sense of, just sadness that the regulators did lay out the framework the way that it did. There is no drug identification number. And this has really caused a lot of different problems within the medical system and the cannabis industry. And it makes it really tough. Communication was another one, and that was perceived to be really important between both the schools, the parents, the families, the medical team as well, to really help sort of navigate some of these challenges and barriers and find solutions. And not only oral communication is important, but also written communication and documentation as well. And then education, that was perceived to be really important for solving some of the strategies and solving some of the challenges and decreasing stigma. And so some participants indicated that standardized education for teachers and administrators might be of benefit and offered insights on what that might look like. And so I won't go through this, but I have a quick slide that shows some of these things that came out about what that education should look like. And then above all, participants indicated that families really require support to navigate medical cannabis in school and in general. And a knowledgeable practitioner who is really willing to take the time to educate, to provide support and advocate on behalf of the patient was considered to be extremely important. And another thing that came up was this value of peer support as well. Category 4 was positive experiences. And I think it's important to note that not all experiences were negative. And you can see some of the quotes here. So many schools are supportive. I think that schools have been very accepting of it. There were also positive experiences that were described just with respect to cannabis medicine in general. And so I like this blue quote here. I think there's so much more to learn, but what is clear is that some children really benefit from this therapy, and we shouldn't let stigma or biases about the fact that it's marijuana or cannabis prevent the kids from getting that benefit. And then finally, we've got improvements over time. And so nearly all really describe the improvements in different things related to medical cannabis in schools and in general, all across the board. So improvements in knowledge, acceptance, policy. And I like this quote a lot here. I've been doing it for a while, and it was like a salmon swimming upstream for years and years and years across all sorts of dynamics. Now it's much less resistance, and I would put schools in there as well. But, some acknowledge that there was still some room to grow. So back to our concluding summary of all of this. I think that even though these school encounters were mixed, there were several similarities between these testimonials. All clinicians really described significant benefits with cannabis-based medicines, but they acknowledged that the role was probably more so in refractory conditions. And I think it was really evident throughout the dialogue that these participants strive to provide excellent care, and they were really great advocates for their patients. And I have to say that as a researcher, I was so impressed about these physicians that were willing to talk to me, and they're busy, and they all took my calls, and they were so gracious to have these chats with me. I think there were remarkably similar perceptions across the board too, with respect to knowledge and stigma and those types of things as well. And I think there's a lot of things that are connected here. So for instance, lack of knowledge obviously leads to stigma. And if you have this lack of knowledge and stigma within the medical profession and in general, then of course that's going to contribute back to this lack of understanding and misunderstandings. And then lack of policy. So the lack of policy within schools with respect to administration and these practical things leads to these pragmatic challenges. However, with these pragmatic challenges, a lot of them are really due to the fact that, there is no DIN with this drug and it's not treated the same as another medication. So, summary slide here. What's next for the Medical Cannabis Schools Working Group? Well, I'm really excited to share our findings with you today, and I think that we'd like to share these by publishing them. We have a study underway that is about caregiver perceptions as well. I really can't talk today. So we're completing that as well. And another avenue we haven't looked at yet is teachers. And so that's an important perception as well. And then I think we really want to move forward with advocating for and supporting families and using maybe some of the ideas that came up from these interviews, like perhaps creating educational materials, looking at maybe standardizing protocols and procedures, and maybe perhaps helping with creating some example templates for school documentation. So I thought I would just end with a few pictures from our experiences working with the schools on the recreational risk reduction program. And I really want to thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Holly. I'm really, again, looking forward to talking a little bit more about some of this with all our panel members. Our last speaker for today is Breanne Stewart, and I'm going to invite her to the stage to speak about some of the regulatory requirements. Over to you, Breanne.
Thank you. First, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that I'm situated on the Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. We had fantastic speakers, which will make my piece a little bit easier. I'm going to be focusing on the complexities of regulated cannabis research in pediatrics, and more importantly, focusing on how do we streamline the process for the future to make things be a little bit easier. So I have no financial conflicts of interest to declare. I am the Associate Director of Clinical Trials for the Maternal Infant Child and Youth Research Network, and I'm also the trial manager for 2 of the interventional trials for C4T. Regulated cannabis clinical trials. Why are we conducting clinical trials? I know that Holly touched on this a little bit, but we really want to generate that high quality evidence to better understand the benefits and health risks of cannabis and cannabis-based products, to be able to study and learn about the safety and efficacy. We also touched on our webinar on Monday, and then Holly also alluded to it, to help guide our practitioners with evidence-based decisions when they're actually prescribing. The 2017 Canadian Pediatric Surveillance Program, one of the barriers that was identified by prescribers was an upwards of 82% said that there wasn't enough evidence and efficacy to support their prescribing, and over 90% wanted to learn more about the dosing and efficacy. So we really want to conduct these clinical trials to be able to generate that evidence and do sub-market authorizations. There's no drug identification numbers, as others have alluded to before, and we need to run these clinical trials to be able to advance the science here. So challenges, we've had a ton of challenges be already talked about from our youth partners. They did a fantastic job. I'll summarize some of them as they relate to a clinical trial and conducting a clinical trial. But when does a clinical trial need to be regulated? That's really important. So Health Canada requires us to conduct clinical trials simply when we want to test cannabis or cannabis product for its therapeutic purposes, when a drug has not been authorized for sale, it's in the drug development phase, or it's being listed, or it's being tested outside of its parameters of the drug identification number, or the notice of compliance. And so for pediatrics specifically, upwards of 80% of the medications that currently have on-label indications are being studied off-label, and therefore we need to run a clinical trial with them and go through this rigorous process. So regulated clinical trials only apply to interventional trials, not the observational studies. So there's kind of two phases here that add to the complexities of these challenges of regulated cannabis clinical trials, the pre-regulatory phase and the post-regulatory phase. So we want to conduct a clinical trial, study cannabis products. We need to obtain a cannabis research license. Some institutions can apply for a cannabis research license, but it's very lengthy. It can take upwards of 6 months to a year. So these things all cause delays in us being able to generate that evidence. We also have to have an import license if we are importing product from outside of Canada. And again, those add to our delays in study startup. Health Canada requires a regulatory submission, so a clinical trial application that is quite lengthy. It's got several components to it. One of them is an investigator brochure, which has non-clinical and clinical information about products. And specifically as it relates to cannabis, Health Canada typically looks for preclinical studies in animals on products that you're going to be testing in human subjects. And as you can imagine, many of these cannabis products from licensed producers don't do animal studies to generate that clinical, that preclinical data to add to an investigative brochure. So being able to find a product that has an investigative brochure so that you can submit it to Health Canada so that you can then conduct the clinical trial is an extreme challenge. Also the GMP, the Good Manufacturing Practice certificates. They have quality reports, chemistry, manufacturing reports, stability reports. All of this data needs to be generated for a product that we add to our Health Canada application to be able to test this product. And this, again, is a real challenge. There is not many companies here in Canada in particular that do produce their products under GMP manufacturing. And so, again, it becomes really challenging to even source a product to run a clinical trial with. We have ethical considerations before we can start a study. If Health Canada approves our study protocol, then we need to go through an individual research ethics board application to have ethics approval. And a consideration for ethics approval is that we need to seek approval from every center that is going to be participating in a trial. So when we have a multi-center trial, if it's running at 5 different centers, depending on the jurisdiction, most of the centers will need their own ethics approval. Again, that adds to delays in that study startup time. I'll talk about some streamlined pathways as we move ahead to see if we can try and reduce some of those. But in the current state, research ethics boards approval needs to be sought out from each center that's applying for the most part. And then to finish up your study startup, we have the contracts process. So we have legal agreements in place to be able to conduct clinical trials for the flow of funds, for liability and insurance, for patient safety. And those are all added challenges that you need to consider when you're running a clinical trial. So then kind of switching gears, the post-regulatory approval, when you run a regulated clinical trial, once you have the approval from Health Canada and the Research Ethics Board, you are bound by Health Canada to do post-regulatory approval. You have post-regulatory approval obligations. And so some of those additional challenges are having a validated database that has audit trails to be able to collect your data in. You need to have secure storage requirements for your actual product, whether that be cannabis or other products. The labeling of the product is another obstacle. So anytime you have an investigational product, a cannabis product, for example, that you want to be testing, you need to have specific labeling on it in both English and in French, and it needs to have labeling on it that indicates that it is for investigational use. So you can imagine that on some of these medical grade cannabis oils, the bottles are relatively small, and we need to add this additional labeling anytime you're using an investigational product. All of these products also have to be temperature monitored. There has to be documentation of the training. There has to be oversight and monitoring. So Health Canada requires the study sponsor to have ongoing oversight. And this is it helps with patient safety and help build that trust, knowing that the trial is being conducted appropriately. But it does increase some of the challenges because it is an added cost. Sometimes the monitors go on site. Because of COVID, we've been able to do a few pieces remotely, but they do go in and they source verify. So they double check that all of the information that is being recorded or collected from a patient from a data perspective is valid and it is being captured appropriately. All of the adverse event and safety reporting is captured. When we run a regulated clinical trial with Health Canada, we have strict requirements of events that we need to report to Health Canada, and cannabis has an added level. So we need to do certain safety reporting within time periods to meet Health Canada's obligations. So this certainly helps build some of that trust, but it also does cause them some additional challenges, and we need to make sure that we're on top of all of those pieces. Records retention, any regulated clinical trial, you need to keep the records for 25 years. That's a Health Canada standard. And then those records need to be archived in a safe place that is secure. Another challenge with this records retention is that oftentimes investigators or their study teams aren't going to be around in 25 years. So coming up with some of those mechanisms to be able to retrieve that data, should there be an audit and you need to go back and pull those records, all of that maintenance needs to be in place. And clinical trials, oftentimes groups or study teams, they operate in silos. And I think that I'm going to touch on this in a little bit because I think we have a real advantage here in pediatrics and working together. But sometimes we reinvent the wheel, we start over, and it creates some of those delays and challenges. So I think our youth partners and Holly, Dr. Mansell, did a fantastic job. So we have our challenges in running a regulated trial. We have challenges in adding cannabis to those regulated clinical trials. And then we have an additional challenge as it relates to pediatrics or children and youth partners. So study design challenges, having blood draws. We can only draw certain volumes of blood, study visits, making sure that they're conducive to families, patients and their families' lifestyle. So parents having to take time off of work, time out of school, ethical considerations, the ethics boards. Each ethics board is independent from one another, and they have a perceived increased risk when it comes to pediatric patients sometimes. So there's some additional challenges and approvals there. We have additional consent and assent forms. We have the issue of contraception. Lots of investigational products are not typically tested in individuals that are pregnant or capable of bearing children. So we have to add in that complexity of contraception and having those conversations. And that's not always the case, but certainly an additional consideration. We also need to understand that we can't just take adult data and apply to children. The pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics are very different, and we need to be able to study the absorption, distribution, the metabolism, elimination from our pediatric patients. Cannabis in schools, so timing again, and can you, if you're designing a clinical trial and conducting a clinical trial, when is the dosing schedule going to be most conducive to patients? Are they able to take it at school, or are these things that we need to keep in mind? The administration of products, so taste, smell, delivery, these cannabis products, coming up with actual delivery mechanisms that are easy to use, that taste great, or not that taste great, but that are tolerable in taste and smell, is also considerations that we need to think about. Accessibility of cannabis products, they're available widely, kind of on the street or in stores, and so when we think about enrollment and recruitment of patients, we need to tailor our study designs to make sure that patients that are participating are using specific products, so we don't have these confounding variables. And then we've talked a lot about stigma, so recruitment and having patients be enrolled in these trials. There can be a stigma, and that can sometimes be an additional challenge in cannabis clinical trials in pediatrics. So back to this operating in silos. This is really a key to streamlining clinical trials for the future and advancing medications and cannabis research in pediatrics is really working together. And we do have a big opportunity here. So what's needed for the future? We need investment in clinical research for maternal child health. So federal funding to be able to invest into this type of research. Ultimately to create a infrastructure, so a maternal child health infrastructure. So we have research teams that are ready to go and in their networks or their own institutes, that when there's funding in place, that we can rapidly deploy that research and move it ahead so that we're not delaying. We saw kind of those challenges of running a regulated trial. So everything that we can do to streamline that process will help generate that evidence efficiently. We also need coordinated advocacy efforts. So Health Canada has their clinical trial regulations, but we need to tailor these regulations with a pediatric focus. So as I mentioned previously, 80% of medications are off-label, and they require us, because they're off-label, they require us to run these regulated clinical trials with all of that rigor in place. So we need to be able to come together as a coordinated group and advocate for risk-based approaches to reduce some of those challenges and barriers in conducting that high quality evidence, but still making sure that it's done safely for patients and that it still has that oversight. And then kind of in clinical trials in general, we need to work towards an overhaul to allow the integration of research into clinical care. This will help reduce some of that stigma, again, around cannabis, but also just access to patients and giving them their options. It's really difficult to approach patients, especially pediatric patients and their families, for research. And we need to have more open-mindedness about integrating research into clinical practice. So what can we do? There's a huge opportunity for pediatrics. Our Canadian geography requires collaboration. We have small patient populations, but we need big numbers for our sample sizes to be able to make some determinations around safety and efficacy to power our studies. And that's where the pediatric space really differs from adult research, is there's a ton of collaboration. So there's already existing research institutes and networks, both nationally and internationally, that do this. C4T is a fantastic example of how that's possible with all of these groups coming together. There's so much collaboration for pediatrics. I think that there's huge potential here. Speaking about MyCERN, so the Maternal Infant Child and Youth Research Network is an organization that links 21 of the maternal and child health research organizations, and it's affiliated with 20 practice-based research. So we support new and emerging teams, and we help develop our national and international partnerships. And that's where C4T kind of came from too, is bringing together those academic groups, those thought leaders, research teams to be able to work together to run these clinical trials specifically for cannabis in pediatrics. And this is what's needed. We need this continued collaboration to move ahead. We also have many partnerships that we need to continue building off of and learning from one another. MyCERN is affiliated with Children's Healthcare Canada networks that are international. So IAC, the Institute for Advanced Clinical Trials for Children, that's a US network. Connect for Children is a collaborative network for European clinical trials for children in the European Union. So working together, learning from one another is going to be really crucial. Our partnerships with Pediatric Chairs of Canada, the NPRIMA, which is a pediatric research organization for the European Medicines Agency, working with groups like the Canadian Institutes of Human Development, IDSEED, so the Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health, to help advocate for funding opportunities to be able to run these clinical trials and generate enough funding, because clinical trials are extremely expensive. Another barrier that I didn't touch on earlier, but I know that you can imagine how expensive these clinical trials can be, just timing wise and process wise. Also working with some of our partners like the Goodman Formulation Center to help come up with pediatric formulations that are tolerable for children and youth, and also working with the Pediatric Trials Network in the US. Again, collaboration is really the key message here with all of these partnerships, working together to advance pediatric research. So in terms of streamlining, MyCERN now and these other organizations are working towards international and national investigator support to help with the planning, development, and execution, particularly in the non-oncology space, but for multi-center clinical trials. So some of these services that we can provide for others to help streamline that process, to move things ahead relatively quickly, navigate this extremely difficult space, is some grant consultation, the pre-award support, study design support. So collaborating with expert groups from Europe, from the US, to be able to draw off of methodological and biostatistical support methods, and really keeping the pediatric focus in mind here. Some post-award services that we can work towards is helping streamline those regulatory submissions to Health Canada, transitioning of an awarded grant into a protocol, and then ethics. So ethics is a really big initiative that we're working on that can streamline pieces for the future. So as I mentioned, we have to do individual ethics applications for specific institutions if they want to participate. MyCern is supporting, along with Clinical Trials Ontario, an initiative called CHEER, which is the Canadian Collaboration for Child Health, Efficiency and Excellence in Ethics Review of Research, with the ultimate goal to have a single ethics application and review for the entire country. And we're still a little ways away from that, but that's what our ultimate goal is. And we're going to try and work towards to streamline that process. As well, coming up with initiatives to provide that monitoring and quality assurance, and also facilitate safety. So adverse event reporting, streamlining those processes to Health Canada, coming up with practices in place that are easy to navigate as we come through this cannabis clinical trial space. Also provide some support in data management and project management. And then lastly, just kind of to wrap up, a couple of the other streamlined services that we're really working towards from a holistic clinical trial perspective for maternal child health is contracts pieces. Again, Dr. Lauren Kelly's has a couple of clinical trials that are coming up. We're working on some partnership agreements to be able to streamline contracts moving forward and reduce some of those study startup timelines, as well as provide some services for placebo development, drug procurement. So obtaining those products from licensed producers as they relate to cannabis, and helping have build those relationships with some of our licensed producers and placebo development groups. So last slide here, I think that the best way we can predict the future is to create it. And the way that we can create it is by this continued collaboration, working together, continuing to learn from one another, share our knowledge, share our processes. And I really think that Pediatrics is in a wonderful place right now to be able to do that. So thank you so much for your time. And if there's any questions, I look forward to discussing them in the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Breanne, for not only sharing your expertise, but also the shared vision of a platform where we can do cannabis research in an efficient and streamlined way across the country. I think that's been really key to getting us off the ground. So thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to invite Trinity and Melila and Zahra and Holly and Jen to join us back on stage. Give everyone a moment to load here. So first of all, thank you all for your presentations. I think this put us in a really great place. I know I have a lot of questions, and we've received a few from Slido and at registration. So I'm just going to dive right in. Building trust is really important. Trust in us personally as researchers and in our studies, but also in the information and the data that we share. Our information is useful if it is accessible and understandable by a broad audience. So when we share study findings, what information, I think this is a question for the youth, what information do you want to know about research? So Trinity, perhaps you can respond first here.
Okay, so thank you, Lauren. As a patient, the first thing that generally I'm looking for when reading study findings, especially in the context of clinical trials, is what group was being studied during the research, so that I can understand really if the research is applicable to myself. So in clinical trials, I'll look at the age group that was studied, what their health conditions were, their disease progression, and the size of the study group, just to know how big it was. And then if the group and the study applies to me, then I go on and look more about what was trialed and how successful it was. It's important for me to know where the study took place as well, so that I can know if it will be applicable with me. So if it will be something that I can mention to my doctors and they'll be like, oh, that happened in Canada, so we can do that here. But if they're like, oh, that happened in Australia, maybe it will be harder for us to access that. So where it took place is also important. And it's also important for us as patients to know the affiliations and credentials of the researchers, so that we can evaluate for any conflicts of interest.
That's great and super helpful. And I think you also made some great points about trusting friends and family for information. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how we get information to them, or if anyone on the panel had thoughts on that.
So again, for sending out information to family and friends, I think through the patient is the best way to do it, because they'll get the information, and sometimes they're the best people to filter through versus what's applicable for them versus what's not, and then share it through there. But even just having like a pamphlet in the clinic with the information that can easily be sent out or spread around to people who are close to the patient.
Excellent. One of the common themes I think that has come up very clearly both days is this idea that we should be really treating cannabis like any other medication. And there's still a lot of stigma around cannabis products and a lot of uncertainties in pediatrics. It's not something we've been studying for a long time. So unfortunately, that means there's a lot of unanswered questions around cannabis for any health-related reason, let alone in children. So Melila, maybe you can answer this one. When you think about any other medications or other therapies or treatments that you might have had, how might your youth peers perceive a cannabis therapy? Would it be the same? Would it be different? What do you think they might think about a cannabis-based medicine?
I think I personally have been immersed in a social circle where the use of cannabis is quite accepted and there's not a lot of stigma around it. So I think in that kind of social scene, there would be a lot of support and a lot of interest and excitement. However, looking a little bit more broad in my life, there's definitely circles where there is a lot more stigma and a lot more kind of questioning it. And I could imagine not only peers, older people in my life as well, thinking, oh, why would you try that when I'm sure there's other medications that have been more studied and you don't know that you know a lot more about them. Why would you choose and go use cannabis? And they may see it as more of a, oh, because it might be more of a recreational thing and not having that clear boundary between, no, this is actually for medical purposes and this is a medication, and thinking, oh, she'd rather use it because it is associated with recreational purposes as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that has a lot to do with the social circles that I am immersed in, and some of them would be a lot more supportive and a lot of them would be a lot more skeptical.
For sure. I think I don't know if anyone else had anything they wanted to add on that point. Holly, did you notice any differences when you were interviewing care providers about schools? Did anyone report any differences with how schools manage regular or other pharmaceuticals versus cannabis-based medicines?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. You know, that didn't really come up at all in the interviews. But, you know, just thinking about in terms of medications, I think that's a really important point, is that all schools really should have a policy for handling medications already, right? And they should be able to document it, and they should have a plan for storage, and it should be prescribed and that sort of thing, or authorized. And so if we treat it like any other medication, we really should be kind of along the right track already.
Sure. One of the questions for Jen that came in from Slido is around different types of clinical trials. So do you think that a wider recognition of real world evidence versus randomized control trial is needed for cannabis, as full spectrum doesn't fit the RCT model?
I absolutely think that real world evidence can actually guide our ideas to sort of look at what we should study. I think that it's really important for us to critically analyze the studies with clinicians who actually use the products to identify anything that may complicate the results. So, for example, I know there's a lot of research on epilepsy, and in Canada, we only have a certain producers we can use. I know that if I use one producer, I might have like a super high success rate with most of the kids. If I use another one, I expect, because I've tried, I hardly get any, and you're using the exact same dose of CBD. So that's just one example. Another example would be anxiety. I know that if I use a product from one company, it can make the anxiety worse, and the same amount of CBD or THC combination, and I'm talking all ages, can make it extremely better. So not only are there differences in the types of products, but everything from the growing of the plant to the extraction to the how it's manufactured and processed, that all affects the product. And then there's the patient factors, being the metabolism, also the absorption of the different carrier oils. So I guess I am just cautious. I think we need randomized controlled trials, but I think we need to critically analyze them as for any potential things that
Yeah.
replicate the results.
For sure, I agree. And it doesn't really fit that nicely in with traditional drug development, right? It's not one compound that has one effect. It's the endocannabinoid system. I mean, these are effects that are seen throughout the whole body. And so it's not really easy to isolate well, I mean, you can study isolates, but when we're talking about full spectrum products, it's hard to sort of isolate really what is acting on what and who is going to improve. And I think that's a place we could also use real world evidence is to look at who's going to respond and who's not responding and see if there's any common traits, whether that be genetics or drug metabolism or concomitant meds or anything that might help people predict better who would respond. Because I think that's something that we see certainly a lot is variability. I think there was a great point. I forget who raised it. It might have been, I think it was you, Zahra, around conflict of interest. And when you're reading a research study, you're looking at the conflict of interest of the authors. And I think that is fantastic. I'm so happy to hear that they're teaching the youth in school about critical appraisal. I think that's really important, and especially around cannabis. When we talk about a product that's, sells recreationally for more than $2 billion a year in Canada, this is a huge industry. So Zahra, are there ways that, academic and independent scientists like myself can maybe distance share like conflicts of interest or abstain from conflicts of interest? Is there anything we can do to help advertise that our studies are independent, I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, just building off of what Melila said earlier, how there's such a large recreational use as well. I think just using different ad tactics than those industries, especially on things like social media, where these ads are always seen, is really important. And, making sure that it's clear that this research is coming from accredited, reliable source, like a university versus another industry. And I think, with time, a lot of people have grown to trust university sources. So just kind of making that more clear.
That's great. I think adding a university logo is something that could be done to sort of identify that that's where this research was done. That's a great one. Trinity or Melila, any other suggestions for kind of branding or wording that we could use to make it clear that we don't have any, financial skin in the game?
Another important thing to remember is it will seem a lot more like an ad or like you're pushing a specific product if you're specifically naming one brand the entire time and not necessarily having like an overview. So if you're pushing a specific product, even if it might appear that that product has the best success, it might appear that the product has been like sponsoring you.
Melila, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, just to add on, I think very similar to what Zahra was saying is that a lot of us see a lot of ads that are coming very much so from the wellness industry. And a lot of that is, recognized by its aesthetics, and it looks very pretty and there's all this nice packaging. And not to say that from the medical side, it can't look nice, but I do think that is an automatic thing of when we're looking at a product. If it has pretty colors and it is appearing on an Instagram ad, I will probably think, oh, this is definitely coming from the wellness industry, as opposed to this is a medical product.
Almost like that scientists aren't necessarily the best at graphics and communication. Breanne, maybe you can add in here a little bit about how researchers could potentially limit or reduce their potential conflicts of interest when designing cannabis studies.
Yeah, and before I touch on that, I also want to touch too from an REB perspective. Sometimes the research ethics boards do require you to remove the branding so that it's not misleading to participants. So there are some mechanisms in place from a research ethics board perspective, but most of them are independent. So that's not always the case across the country, but I just wanted to add that in there. But yeah, as it relates to conflict of interest, we need to be able to separate the licensed producer piece from study design pieces. There are ways that we can get almost like brokers involved that really focus on study drug or drug procurement that keep the study design piece out of there. I know that having these conversations, we have to sign confidentiality agreements, but really having an independent person doesn't allow that influence from a licensed producer into the product. We also kind of have agreements in place, so material transfer agreements that can separate out pieces from the product and the actual publication of results to minimize some of that influence.
Excellent. I think that's really helpful. I know it's helpful for me because it's something where, in cannabis, it's a tight space. Clinical trials are very expensive, and cannabis oil is very expensive, and grant budgets are very small. So oftentimes we do rely on investigational products being either provided in kind or in some sort of partnership with, either a hospital research institute or another sort of external partner to fund these trials. So it's important that we think about how we can both move the space forward, but also ensure that what we're doing is still trusted science. I think the worst thing at the end of the day of, putting several years into clinical trials is having people look at it and say, oh, well, they were involved with the company and disregarding it. And so I think it's really important we think about that at the beginning. And so I appreciate all of your responses on that. We did get another question in from Slido about what is the best way to tackle stigma regarding the use of THC in medical cannabis, especially related to children. Jen, maybe you wanted to tackle this and maybe you can touch on some of your experiences here in Manitoba. I think you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah. So I personally don't use a lot of THC in kids. So I will just generally answer that. I usually refer to any of the cannabis products that the kids that I see are using as medicine. And that's how we sort of refer to it as. And so in Manitoba here, my son was the first one to use cannabis in schools for his epilepsy, and he has a G tube. So that meant that we were giving it through a G tube during the school day, because it actually worked much better giving it 4 times a day rather than twice or even 3 times. And so we sort of made protocols as we went. And fortunately, the school that he was in was very open. And so when it came to working with other kids, we actually had a protocol that we could roll out. And because we'd already done it, I found that precedent was everything. And I made myself available to all of the kids and their schools. And I went to the schools, I did presentations on cannabis. I took questions beforehand so that I could answer things. And I found that schools were really wanting to support these kids. And once they actually had a face to the prescriber and they knew who was behind it, they had my phone number and they could call me at any time and ask questions. They settled down a lot about it. And it's just been treated like any other medication here. And so we've just sort of steamrolled that out. And now that it's there, now we're just fine tuning it. And the other thing that I found super helpful was doing presentations to the URIS nurses that work with these kids, because those are the nurses that are administering the oils through mouth or G tube. And once they were on board and comfortable with it, it really made the whole situation a lot easier. One barrier we found was there was one time when a nursing policy actually prohibited the youth from having medication, because a lot of these kids actually can't self-administer. So there was a regulation that the student could have the medicine, but they had to administer it themselves. So I actually had to escalate that way up to nursing policy to change, because that child couldn't take their own medicine and they actually needed someone to help. So that's all changed, but identifying those barriers that normally isn't a problem for other kids.
I wonder, I really like your idea around having standard protocols, referring to it as a medicine, and really just kind of pushing that this should be treated the same way and is important, and developing some protocols. I wonder if there's a way that we can roll that out to other provinces. And I don't know, Holly, if there's anything around cannabis education in schools still happening, or if there's plans to roll in some more medicinal cannabis education in Saskatchewan. I don't know if you had a different perspective in our prairie neighbor.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. We need to kind of get in there and do that. I think the thing about adding things into the curriculum is teachers will tell you that they have a lot already, especially in a school where they maybe don't have a child at the time. So I think building that education into existing programs is maybe something to look at. So if there is like a recreational risk reduction program, maybe that's a place that you can embed that piece about the medical cannabis as well, and at the same time sort of help with that stigma.
For sure. And the next question is for you as well, Holly, around involving families in schools and planning cannabis studies, because I guess that's a different concept, because these children may only be on a cannabis product for a short time, right? Or it may be a placebo product. It sounds really important direction for those of us who are planning these studies. There's some potential ways that us, Holly, and maybe you know the most about this, around how we can learn what happens in schools. You know, for me, it's so distant. My children are very young. They're still in daycare and preschool. So, you know, the concept of what youth are taught and how we could work with schools is very foreign. I don't know if you had some tips for working with educators.
Yeah, I'll agree. Before we got into the schools, I was the same way. And I think the best way for researchers and any of us to get in is to like really get involved and ask questions and get connected. And so just like we kind of think of this whole patient-oriented research where we involve the patient in the process, I think you need to reach out to those stakeholders, whether it's teachers or students or parents or whatever. And I think, you know, when I'm thinking back to the program, the recreational risk reduction program, the first thing we did is we formed an alliance with some school nurses and their students that were already kind of connected in that school. And so that gave us access to that target population. So we could ask those questions, you know, what do you want to know? What do you guys think? And so I think maybe that's one way to kind of do that is get connected.
And I think that that's a great point about it, and great about getting connected and just sort of jumping in and asking lots of questions. I wonder, are there other stakeholders like outside of schools and youth that we should think about involving at the beginning when we're designing cannabis studies?
I think it's really important for a holistic approach, especially in pediatrics. And I think involving all parties of a child's life, like you said, you know, parents and other family members, even whether that's grandparents or older siblings, and, you know, the teachers, the school admin, if there is a school nurse. I know personally in elementary school, I did not have a school nurse in my school. But I think if the medication is going to be administered during school hours, whoever that person is, it's really important for them to be involved as well, because they'll have a really powerful perspective that, you know, someone else may not have.
The next question here is for you, Breanne. Sorry, I realized my mic was muted there. Is around international things that are happening outside of Canada. So this is a question that came in during registration. In comparison to other countries, how much more progressive or advanced are we here in Canada working in this space? How can we collaborate, support, and learn from what happens with cannabis research in other countries?
Yeah, thank you. I think attending conferences, webinars, being open-minded is step one. Really providing yourself with opportunities to learn from one another, but that collaboration. I had kind of touched on some of these partnerships, looking beyond our own country. We talked about some of the challenges about sourcing product, and I think as it relates to cannabis and my personal experience in sourcing product, we looked internally, and there was a real opportunity to look outside and reach out to other research groups that are in the same position, that are building networks, cannabis networks, or other pediatric networks, and really creating opportunities to meet with them, talk with them, meet with licensed producers from various countries, and see what's out there. Hearing their experiences and their challenges is really beneficial. Oh, I think you're muted again.
Every time. Jen, I know you've done some work with some other countries. I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add in here about sharing international expertise in pediatric cannabinoid therapeutics.
I haven't done a lot in terms of research with other countries, but I do have kids from different families that reach out from all over. And I do agree that collaboration is the best, because once we can learn what other countries and what other models are existing, it helps broaden our perspective and show us different ways that we can incorporate cannabinoids where we live.
For sure. And I think especially because a lot of the cases are really rare, that there may not be a lot of cases here in Canada. So it may be beneficial to clinically sort of collaborate with colleagues that may be seeing these children in other places. I like the idea of learning together and sharing with our collaborators overseas. Melila, the next one is for you. You mentioned a really important point, and this leads into sort of one of the questions from Slido as well, about getting health information into the hands of kids, and particularly around how researchers could better support their autonomy in healthcare. So what do you think would be sort of the best format to deliver this? Who should give you this information? And yeah, what do you want it to look like? I guess not now. Think like 10 years ago, you.
Yeah, I think the best format for younger kids would definitely be videos, because I don't think there's a very big interest to sit down and read, and the reading comprehension at that age is not strong enough. So I really think the best format would be videos, whether that be animated or just other educational videos that could either come from different clinics or hospitals. And I think important information to provide, well, the first thing would be to not make it too overwhelming, because in the world of science, there's always more and more information. So I think to really keep it down to the key basic ideas, and I think the three main things to get across would be, one, how the said treatment, let's say, works, and then two would be the pros of it, the possible benefits, and then the cons, so the possible side effects. And I think also a good thing to add would just make sure that it's coming from a very inviting and calm narrative, given that this will definitely be new information for these kids and also may seem a little bit scary. Make sure that it's coming from a very friendly approach and something that doesn't seem too intimidating, and really just outlining what is going on and what might be beneficial and what the cons of it might be as well. And I really think the best format would be some kind of video or movie kind of type thing.
And would this be something, I guess, that hospitals could kind of post? Like, do they have disease-specific like web pages or advocacy groups? Like, who should share this information? Or I guess, how do we get it to you once we create it?
I mean, I think this would be a similar answer to what we were talking about earlier in terms of social media recruitment, that type thing of where are you getting your information from. So I can imagine if you went to your doctor, let's say, and they're talking about a possible treatment, if the doctor could send a link or direct to a specific website that they know of and say this to the parent, this would be a really great resource to show your child, and the parent can just set it up in front of the patient and they can watch it. So whether it comes directly from a doctor, I think that would be a great thing. I don't know of particular websites that have that already, so I'm not really sure about that. And that might be another thing that could be created of specific hospitals or clinics or universities even making very reliable information for kids. So I'm not aware of any in particular that already exist, and maybe that's because they don't, or I just don't know of them. But yeah, I think coming from the same resources that we were talking about before.
Yeah, and I wonder, Breanne, I don't know if you have an idea of if there's any groups across Canada that might be looking at like how we communicate. Like, I'm sure there's some actual science to communicating this to kids, right? You know, I have a 3-year-old, and depending on my tone of voice, the understanding is different. So I'm sure there's a whole learning here about how we can communicate important health information, clinical research, trial opportunities, data. I don't know if there's any ongoing initiatives in Canada about that. I don't know, Breanne, if you had anything you wanted to add.
No, but I think that the knowledge translation piece is key, and I think that part of our role here from my son's national perspective is developing tools and templates and a centralized place to go so you can access some of those resources to be able to for research teams to target. The Canadian Institutes of Health Research, CHR's website has some patient engagement platforms and some different resources there to be able to target these educational pieces so that you do deliver it in the right format to the right people. We also have some educational consultation as we're designing some of our programs and our study design groups and things like that. So definitely we need more resources that are easily accessible in one place, one hub that you can go to. But I think that your youth perspectives are certainly enlightening and are areas that we can focus on moving forward to advance this.
Yeah, I think that's an added bonus of including youth at the beginning means you get to use their brain power at the end too for how you share our study findings. So Zahra, a question for you around your involvement with C4T and designing some cannabis research studies. I wondered if you wanted to share maybe some of your positive experiences and potentially some steps that we could improve on how we engage youth in designing research.
That's honestly a great question. It has been such an amazing experience to be able to, bring insight on what is important for us as youth on the things like an outcome of a research study or the design or, just being able to make researchers aware about things like a youth's school life or social life. And these are factors that I think could definitely be overlooked, but, are very important. And I think in C4T, we definitely have a lot of discussions around outcomes of a research study. And, personally, youth may feel that things like how many days they're able to see their friends might be a really important outcome for them, whereas a researcher might have like a different outcome or a different goal on deciding if a treatment is working or, if it's effective. And I think for next steps, it's, important to keep in mind certain factors that youth do have other commitments and other responsibilities. So, making sure that the research studies are accessible, whether that is like a virtual option and making it time efficient and things like that.
What about inviting them to spend 2 hours on a webinar panel? I think those are all amazing ideas, and I think we're always looking to improve. So trying to keep that communication door open and meeting with you all reasonably regularly. Obviously, you have busy schedules, and so I think that's something good for us to keep in mind too. That everyone is busy, so being efficient when we do meet. So not just scheduling meetings to meet, but to also make sure that we have we're catching up every time that we chat. Since the legalization of cannabis, recreational cannabis, obviously recreational cannabis for anyone who is tuning in that is not here in Canada is still illegal in the pediatric population, but is available for those who are over the ages of 18 or 19, depending on what provinces you're in. So this is a question, I guess, sort of for you, Breanne, and maybe Holly, if you had some insights here on how do we pick a product or procure a product for a clinical trial? What has been your experience, Breanne? Maybe you can talk a little bit about our shared experience in procuring cannabis products for our investigational trials. And if you had any ideas of what Health Canada could do to make this process easier for researchers.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So sourcing product is an extreme challenge. And I think the starting place is really meeting with all of the companies, seeing what products are available. You can see things that are online, but really making those connections, arranging one-on-one meetings with some of these licensed producers, because we really need to understand what type of manufacturing processes are in place. Do they have supporting documentation? So that investigator brochure that I spoke about that has some of those non-clinical and clinical aspects of their product, because that's really our starting place right now with Health Canada, is we know the specific requirements. When we talk about we want to treat cannabis like a drug, Health Canada is saying if we want to research it, then we need to treat it like a drug. And what comes along with that is all of those requirements. So really meeting with these companies, figuring out what products they have, what processes are in place, and also supply. We've run into big supply issues. There are some companies that do have product and they do meet Health Canada's requirements, but they run out of supply. And so when we're running a clinical trial, we need to make sure that we have enough in stock to be able to run the trial from start to finish. So those are some of the challenges. And then, of course, building that relationship and trust with the licensed producer so that they are on board with the kind of with your academic agenda and what you hope to set out from these clinical trials. So building that rapport with licensed producers is really important. And then engaging in some contracts. So some of those material transfer agreements that I talked about, making sure that they're providing that in-kind product without that intellectual property piece, and determining outcomes of study design. So that's something that we keep in mind when we're sourcing product. Now, in terms of Health Canada and what can we do to make this process easier, reducing some of those barriers related to actually conducting a clinical trial and the labeling requirements, the good manufacturing, certifications that need to be in place, it really reduces the amount of products that are available for us to even be able to test. So maybe having a little bit more risk-based approach in their framework of what the requirements are, some of that preclinical data that they look for in animal studies, really it limits our options for products that we can use from licensed producers. So yeah, a risk-based approach from a regulatory framework, I think, would be really beneficial from Health Canada for all pediatric clinical trials that we run, but specifically for cannabis.
For sure. I don't know, Jen, if you had anything to add in about, like, when we select a product, how do we pick where to start? And I wonder about how we can use that real world evidence, the data that you have on your patients and others have on the patients that we have around even a starting dose, a starting product. Where do we begin? Obviously, there's lots of options on the recreational market, but not so much when we come to those products that we can actually, get through the regulators.
I think that's a huge problem, because even when we look at everything that has to be in place, like Breanne was saying, there's only a couple that I can tell you, and I won't, but that could produce a product like that. And they are the biggest companies in the world. So you use their product, right? And then you do a study and you find it's effective. Well, then you're almost supporting that company. So there's just these innate problems, because the smaller companies, they might not have all the things that we need to use it for research, right? So that's really tricky, So the other thought I had was even having a 3-arm trial where you have 2, say, full spectrum products from different companies. That way you eliminate any, you put the 2 against each other to try to generalize the results a little bit more.
That's a fantastic idea. I hadn't actually considered looking at 2 different products. I mean, an absolute paperwork nightmare for Breanne.
So you have 2 full spectrum products, right? Well, how do you know that one isn't have something in it that's affecting the results? So if you have 2 full spectrum products and a 3rd arm of a placebo or whatever, maybe we can extrapolate the results a little bit better. The other idea I had was there's a lot of extractors actually that will make anything for you. Developing what you want in a product and being able to fund making the product is not actually super hard, because a lot of these companies actually have all the licenses already for all the the processes that you need. So that's another way we could produce a product to use in research and not like have a bias towards one LP. Those are just thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, especially, when you mentioned some of the smaller companies that might not have, GMP or some of the other things that the bigger companies might have. And these may be some of the companies that offer pediatric discounts. And so, we want to make sure we can study what people are using. The next question here is perhaps for the youth, and then maybe Holly, some practical steps for you as well. But what kind of education do you currently get about cannabis in high school? So Trinity, I don't know if you wanted to start here. What are your experiences? Do you learn about cannabis? What do you learn about cannabis? And also, I personally would like to know, what do you learn about clinical trials?
So to start with, for cannabis, we honestly learned nothing. In high school, the closest education we got was in grade 9 health class, when we were just learning about general street drugs and illicit drugs. And we talked about cannabis, maybe a bit. Our teacher, in my experience, she was amazing. She came from a very neutral point of view and just was like, I'm giving you guys the information. You have to make your own decisions about what you want to do and what you don't want to do, but here's the information. And then in university, even in the health science stream, and even though it's legal and even though it is prevalent, we have still gotten no education about it. And then in terms of clinical trials, absolutely no education on that either. Even in specific research classes that I'm taking in university, we haven't really discussed anything about clinical trials, which is disappointing. So all of my knowledge from it has come from real life experiences and working with C4T.
Wow. I'm very glad to hear that you had some very neutral teachers and that they had some good experiences. I don't know, Zahra or Melila, if your experiences are the same or different as Trinity's with regards to education?
I agree with Trinity that, we did not learn anything about cannabis in school, both in high school and in university. I have personally learned about clinical trials, just more on the gold standard of research studies and, double blinding and just kind of the foundation and how they would be, executed. And I do appreciate learning those things, but I definitely do wish that we learned more on, how to find one and how to participate in one. So I am so thankful for the knowledge that I have learned from C4T and other things outside of school.
You're making me blush. Melila, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just had a very similar experience to both Zahra and Trinity, especially in high school. I got no education about, I got a little bit of education about cannabis from a recreational standpoint, but very similar to Trinity, just to know what are drugs kind of viewpoint, but not for very long, and had no education about cannabis from a medical perspective, and especially in high school, didn't learn anything about clinical trials really. In university, in any research methods courses that I've taken, or even statistics courses, we do learn about kind of the process of research and the process of clinical trials, but similar to what Zahra said, it's all from a researching perspective, which does make sense, but never got exposure to kind of the back end of it, of how would you be involved in one and what would that entail. But overall, not very much education on any of those points.
Fair. Holly, maybe you could add here some practical steps for integrating education on therapeutic cannabis into a curriculum.
Yeah, so these comments here that we're hearing are exactly kind of why we started with creating the program that we did in Saskatchewan, because here the cannabis was covered really with illegal drugs, and the message was just say no, so it wasn't really in the right context anymore, and there's some changes that needed to happen to it. I think the one thing that I've learned that is important is that if you're going to try and make something to embed it into the curriculum, or you want teachers to actually use it and it be accepted, you really need to do your homework, and you need to find out, what education is actually present where, meaning in what years of the curriculum. And then you have to develop your materials so that they're actually linked to the proper curriculum outcomes for that age group. And that might be different depending on the province. And so, that's what we found, is we put ours in grade 7 and grade 9 because that's where it fit in Saskatchewan's curricular outcomes. And I think one of the things I'd suggest too is it's best to start talking to the Ministry of Education, or whatever it's called in that province, early, and involving them in that process up front, because obviously getting feedback during the process is much better and helpful than going to them with resources completing and just kind of expecting them to plunk it in.
For sure. I'm gonna, as we sort of wind down the panel here, I think you have all made some very excellent points. I think we have some homework to do around educating youth on the therapeutic potential of cannabis, but also how cannabis works and some of the complexities on cannabis and the uncertainties as well. And also about clinical trials and how to find them and sort of why we need them, and just more sort of the operational and logistics behind them. So I have one final question, and I'm going to ask each one of you to answer it for me. The theme of today was, of course, tomorrow's answers and how we move forward through research and education. So I'm going to ask each of you if you could tell me what is one actionable step to move the space of cannabis research with children and adolescents forward here in Canada. So I think, Trinity, I'll maybe ask you, and I'll just go around my screen here.
Okay, so for me, my idea for an actionable step to move the space of cannabis research forward with children and with young adults is to improve the education in the general public about cannabis use medicinally in order to get rid of the stigma that remains around it. So specifically, the public really needs to understand the therapeutic benefits of cannabis, especially within the healthcare setting. And so for research to move forward, patients have to be willing to participate in clinical trials. And this isn't going to happen if they aren't educated on it and if their families are still following a very conservative approach and don't want to focus on the benefits and are only focused on the risks. For me personally, when I was in the pediatric world, I was first prescribed Navalone. And even though it's just a synthetic cannabinoid, I had to deal with a lot of stigma from certain family members. And I just wish that they could have been educated about it, even given a pamphlet that focuses on, sure, educating about the risks, but also the benefits, because if there's no education about the benefits, then nobody will be willing to even participate in clinical trials, and the stigma will just drag the space of cannabis research back into the past.
Thank you, Trinity. That was incredibly insightful. And I couldn't agree with you more. I have nothing to say because all I can say is yes, everything you said, and then some. Zahra, over to you next.
I agree with Trinity. I think that education is a really big thing to start off with. And I think this, the younger generation, like, we're so much more open-minded than, older generations. And I think getting that knowledge integrated from a young age in school and teaching children about cannabis from, a medicine point of view, and that it's not just a recreational thing, can just kind of open those doors more to allow more research. And, children go home and they talk to their parents about it, and maybe their parents will do some further research, and just kind of getting that word out and, breaking that stigma to allow for more research to happen.
That's a great point. Melila?
Yeah, very similar to Zahra and Trinity. I really think education is the biggest action that you can take right now. I think a lot of people focus on the concept of, oh, well, we don't know enough about cannabis, especially when it comes to working with treating youth, which is true. But I think people get really comfortable with that statement of we don't know enough, there's not enough research, when there is also a lot that we do know. So really focusing on educating about, we do know how it works, and these are the things that we do know, and these are the benefits that we do know, so that people don't just get comfortable sitting with but we don't know anything. And that will create a lot more comfortability and decrease stigma. So I think that would be one big step, is just giving out the information of, this is what science has said, and this is what we do know so far.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic point around what we know and what we don't know. We just finished reviewing all of the literature out there, and there are more than 40,000 kids that have been in observational studies on cannabis. Cannabis has been around for hundreds of thousands of years. This is not something where we have like an acute safety concern per se. And so I do think that you make a great point around, yes, there are some uncertainties, but saying, oh, we don't know anything really isn't an option anymore. Holly, over to you.
Yeah, I would, of course, wholeheartedly agree with the education. But just to add to that, I think stories are really important. And this is something I heard in the interviews. And of course, I didn't have time to share it. But just the power of a personal experience. One personal experience is enough to change someone's opinion and can really decrease stigma. And so I think, if you're a parent, a great way to advocate, or a patient, is to share your story and your tribulations and your challenges, as many of our patient partners do with C4T. I think, if you're a researcher, one of the things that we can do is publish. So like just taking the studies that we talked about today, for instance, anybody within the cannabis space, none of these things were surprising. We all knew that this was out there, and really there's no surprises here. But I think, sometimes that anecdotal stuff isn't enough. And so if we can start documenting this and putting it in the literature, just as healthcare providers really want to see the evidence when it comes to prescribing medications, I think policymakers probably need to know about the problem too. And so we can document that as we go forward and do our research.
And I think we're in a great space here in Canada to do that, because with C4T, we have 101 different members. We can bring some of those cases and do some of the qualitative work that we hear about all the time. And, we kind of have our, not bubble, because it's quite big, and really all comers are welcome, but it really does sort of help other people learn from our experiences as well, and all the things that we hear from the individual families. I think that's a great point, and we should really look at how we share that information and make it accessible to others. Breanne, what are your thoughts on a concrete step to move this space forward?
Yeah, so I think we can appreciate that there's some anecdotal evidence, but we also have heard many times that we need that evidence base. And so I think finding pathways and mechanisms so that we can advocate to reduce some of those challenges and barriers from that regulatory perspective to be able to conduct those clinical trials, helping advocate from a pediatric perspective or child and youth perspective to adopt a risk-based framework to allow the conduct of these clinical trials really efficiently. And also, I think something that's really important that I kind of touched on, where again, I think huge opportunity for pediatrics is that collaboration and building a national infrastructure so that we don't duplicate efforts, that we have streamlined resources and services in place so that we can conduct trials really quickly, efficiently, without reinventing the wheel every time. Not sourcing product over and over again, but having multiple products to use in a really streamlined fashion.
I love the idea of studying multiple products. I heard you say it, and I'm like, you're already convinced. I see it in your face.
my goal, my ultimate dream, and I mean, even particularly for pediatrics, having different delivery mechanisms that aren't just the oils and things like that, but that are tolerable for youth and children. I think it's really important.
Jen, what are your thoughts?
I think there's 4 different categories of things that need to be addressed. So education, the healthcare system, the community, and policy. So right now, I think I'm working a lot with giving presentations to my colleagues. Different groups are requesting it: hematology, oncology, developmental peds. They all want to know. And so just going and educating, because we want collaboration with traditional medicine as well, not just within the cannabis space, but we all have to work together. And they're starting to see the kids change, so they want to know why. So then getting us all on the same page. The other thing, exciting thing, will be developing and implementing a cannabinoid curriculum in the med school here, because the residents really want to know a lot about it. So although that works to, decrease the stigma, and it creates curiosity. The amount of times I get asked if my son smokes pot and is he high, I still get that question. So, the education needs to start from the ground floor, talking about everything. So those are the things I'm working on in the next month.
I think that's also one aspect that you just touched on that we hadn't really brought up today, is around healthcare and around cannabis use in the healthcare system. So I think that's something we didn't necessarily get to today, but I think things like policy are really needed there. We don't want to wait until a kid needs to administer medical cannabis in the hospital to have a policy. We should have one ready so that when the situation does arise, these children feel supported and not like this is some add-on thing that like they're the first and this is, out of place, but that the hospitals are prepared and ready for this. And so I think that's something maybe at C4T that we can work on with our site leads across Canada. And so with that, I'd just like to thank everyone, all of our panelists today, for sharing your extensive expertise. This has been really rewarding, and I'm glad it's recorded so that everyone else can learn from you all as well. I'd like to acknowledge our funding agencies and all of our research partner organizations. This is a broad net. It takes a lot of people to make this ship sail. And so thank you to everyone who's been involved with C4T. And just the next slide, this session is being recorded. As I mentioned, we will post it on our website. It will be available. It will remain on YouTube. You can stream it at any time. Please share it broadly. And again, you can also invite others to find this information on our website. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any questions, our contact information can be found on the website, and I'm happy to connect you with any of the speakers that you heard from either today or on Monday. And please join us again in future for our next webinar offerings, which will hopefully be available in the spring.